Welcome to the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you level up your instruction in order to craft authentic learning experiences for both you and your students. I'm your host, Lee Tucker, a high school English teacher and ed tech enthusiast, and I want to join you on your journey to becoming the best instructor that you possibly can. So if you're ready, grab your adventuring gear and let's get going. What is up, everybody? Today is Thursday, July 30th, 2020, and this is the debut episode of the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast. I'm excited about getting this show started, and I know some of you might be wondering why somebody would start a podcast in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic, but sometimes when you got to do something, you just got to do it. The idea behind this show is pretty simple. I'm going on a journey and I want others to join me in finding authentic ways of teaching content to my students to create an authentic learning experience, not just for my students, but for myself as well. We spend a lot of time in our classrooms and we should be able to enjoy it just as much as our students should. So we'll take a look at lots of different things, look at new ideas, things that are working with other teachers around the country and around the world potentially. But the format of the show is pretty simple. We'll introduce the show and I will open up the treasure chest, and inside will be some kind of golden nugget of wisdom that I come across, whether it's a quote from somebody, a tip for some ed tech resources, or just a thought that we can take with us into our classrooms. After that, we will have a boss battle, which any of you gamers out there know. Boss battles are where you gain a lot of experience and often will level up. So those will be featured content segments where we learn some new things that we can hopefully implement into our classes and level up our teaching experience. And then finally, we'll have what I call the 8-bit crew board, which is if you've played RPGs, a lot of times you join guilds, and those guilds have message boards where people can post some quests and things like that. And this is where we get to work together as a community, where I get to hear and view some of your feedback, and we can connect together as teachers. It's tough to do this job alone, and when you have a community behind you to encourage you and share ideas with, then it makes things a whole lot easier and better for all of us. Before we get into the treasure chest segment, though, I do want to take a minute to just mention my Mastering Google Classroom course that I have up on Udemy. I know a lot of teachers are having to learn how to do online instruction now. So I have put up a course. It's a 2-hour course that will take you through everything that you need to know about Google Classroom and how to utilize that for your classroom, not just for online learning, but also ways that you can use it in class as well. So you can use a combination. And the reason I did this is back in the spring when we had to go to online instruction, I had been using Google Classroom and a lot of online stuff all year long. And so when we switched, and it was an immediate switch, and we didn't have a whole lot of time to plan and figure things out. We were just kind of thrown into it. But my students were already familiar with how a lot of that stuff worked online. And so they had a fairly easy transition over into online learning. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a lot easier for me to try to teach them online because they had already been using all of this stuff. So I will put a link up in the show notes if you are interested in that. Click on the link and join the course. And I will also be doing some promos for it. If you follow me online, I'm at Comic Socks. Try to get out some free and heavily discounted prices for this, so that I can, as many teachers as possible can get through this to be ready for any potential online teaching. But with that being said, let's take a look and open the treasure chest for today. Today's treasure chest are a few keyboard shortcuts for Google Chrome to help you with navigating some of your tabs. So it's 3 different shortcuts. The first is going to be Control-T, or if you're on a Mac, Command-T. That opens up a new tab in the window that you are currently working in. The next one is Control-W, which closes the current tab that you have open. But the last one is the one that I really want to focus on. So what happens, I know a lot of you may be like me where you accidentally close a tab out. I'm working and I'm instead of clicking on the tab, I might have clicked the X to close the tab out, or maybe I was closing a few tabs out at once and accidentally clicked one out. Well, what do? The easiest fix to this is the shortcut Control-Shift-T. What that does is that opens up a recently closed tab. So whichever tab you just previously closed, it's going to pop back up exactly where you were, which is super helpful. And it's not just limited to one. You can open up several tabs. So if you accidentally closed out a bunch, you can just Control-Shift-T, or if you're on a Mac, Command-Shift-T to reopen a closed tab. It's super helpful. I've used it so many times because I'm always kind of accidentally closing stuff out. For today's featured content, our boss battle is just an introduction to me and who I am. So I'm going to tell you my story in education next. So I wanted to spend this first episode telling the story of how I went from a naive 22-year-old college graduate to where I am today. I'm a big believer that stories can be our greatest teachers as well as our greatest source of connection to others. So originally I went to school and got my undergraduate in youth ministry and spent a short period of time working as a youth minister in a church. And after that short stint, I kind of realized it wasn't really working out for me and I didn't know what to do. So I did what all college students seem to do after they graduate. I moved back home. It was a reluctant decision because I wanted to be independent, wanted to be on my own. But I also knew that I needed to regroup and kind of revisit myself. And so I moved back home and got a job working just at an environmental lab for a while. And while I was there, this idea of teaching kept popping into my head. I come from a family of teachers. My mom is a teacher. Several of my aunts and uncles are teachers. So teaching is something that I have always been around the education world. I remember being younger and spending afternoons in my mom's classroom after school, thinking that I was cool because I got to wander around the hallways after school when nobody else was there, and I got to go into the teacher's lounge back when those were actually a thing. And so education has always been a part of my life. And so I thought that would be something that I could do. I've really enjoyed working with teenagers and knew that I was good at imparting knowledge to others. That had been my favorite part of working as a youth minister was just teaching information to others. So I went back to school and I took my licensing test and got a temporary license while I was finishing up the secondary degree. And I interviewed for a job and I got hired on at Villarica High School back in 2007. I'm still there today. And I had absolutely no clue what I was getting myself into. My first day in class back in 2007 was literally my first day in a classroom. Most teachers go through training and student teaching and all that. I came in through the back door, and so I had never stepped in front of 30 students who were waiting for me to do something. And I was extremely nervous my first day. And also, I was thrown into the deep end right away. In fact, I'll tell this story probably on a later episode, but on my very first day of teaching, I almost got into a fight with a student, or I won't say fight. I thought he was going to attack me. But like I said, I'll talk about that one in a later episode. So my first years, they were pretty rough. I was angry a lot. I lost my temper a lot in class. My test scores were abysmal. I even, at one point in my first few years, had an administrator who told me that teaching wasn't for everybody. And that might sound harsh. In truth, it was probably actually pretty accurate for me at that time. I was not doing a great job. Even though most of my students liked me, I just wasn't being effective. I knew how to put lessons together. I knew how to convey information, but I had a really hard time with motivating and engaging students. I was teaching the way that I learned in class. A lot of lecture based, a lot of drill and kill. I tried to do literary discussions, but nobody would talk. And so I grew resentful and frustrated. I began to make excuses that, it wasn't my job to motivate. My job was to teach students, to give them information. It was my students' fault. I can't believe, they don't know how to behave in a class. They don't know how to take notes and all that kind of stuff. And I even, I used to joke that, students would probably pay more attention if there was a video of me playing on a screen instead of listening to me in person. And then flash forward 10 years later when I found out about flipped classroom video lessons. But it was a real struggle. Things got a little bit better as I moved through that first decade, but I still struggled a lot. I got really frustrated a lot to the point where several times I just wanted to be done with it. There were several times where I looked for other jobs. There was even one point where I had set up an interview with this company and taken the day off to go to the interview. But it seemed like every time I was at that point of giving up, something would always pull me back. And I had this realization that it was my fault that there were problems going on in my classroom. It was not my students. I realized that this cell phone fad, it wasn't going away. That short attention spans are probably not going away anytime in the near future. And so instead of trying to fight against the current and throw the blame everywhere, I decided that I wanted to try to redirect that into something useful and something beneficial for my students. And it did not get better automatically. I still struggled. I still had my frustrations, but I finally came to this turning point. And it was the year 2018, 2019 was a real turning point for me in my career. Prior to that, which might sound weird, but I didn't know that ed tech was actually a thing. I had not, heard of a lot of things. I didn't know what a PLN was. I essentially did not know that there was anything outside of myself and my school. It was really just kind of me with my head buried in the sand. All I thought I had were maybe a few search things that I could find on Google and whatever I talked to with other teachers in my school. And that year, I really began to expand a lot of my influence and a lot of my resources. There are a few people who were very key influencers for me that year. One of them was one of our assistant principals, Dr. Cynthia Beers in our county. She caught wind that I was like this tech guy, which I don't really know how she heard about it. I try to fly under the radar, but she ended up sending me to a few workshops along with the Georgia Ed Tech convention that year. And I went to a couple of Google workshops. I went to the tech convention, and my mind was just blown. If any of you have gone to one of those major conventions, you know, like that first year that you go, how almost kind of like awe-inspiring it is. I walked into this place, and it was like, whoa, there are other people like me. It was weird. It was amazing. And I learned a ton of stuff through a lot of that. And then at the same time, in that same year, about this same time frame, I had been encouraged to apply for this new group that our district was creating. And the lady that's the head of it, Dr. Marissa Gondo, she created this group. We eventually called it the E3 Innovators, the Educators Empowering Educators. And the idea was taking some of this professional learning and hitting it on the ground level, where we are sharing throughout our schools, not having to always bring in some big name, but that we're utilizing the talents that are already within our schools and our districts to share with others, to empower them to try new things and do greater things in their classroom. And so I was accepted into that group, and again, just feeling encouraged and empowered. I found kind of who I was. All of a sudden, I felt like I had found my place in education. I started blogging at that time, just writing about things that I was trying in my class, writing about some tips that I came across. I joined Twitter and started connecting with other educators online. And it was amazing because I would see all these things that people were trying, and, I'd try them out in my class too. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but I was part of this community, and I was learning and I was growing. And then the following year, I even stepped out more. I applied to do presentations at some conferences and got accepted to several conferences to do presentations for STEM and ed tech stuff. I got to do a few presentations at the Georgia Ed Tech conference, which was really great. It was really amazing. And I just started trying all these different things. And it was amazing to see the transformation in 2 years, what had happened to me. I went from a traditional English teacher, read and write, let's discuss a little bit. I took that and transformed it into new things last year. I had my students created video presentations. They did some choose your own adventures in Google Slides. They made some podcasts. Some of the favorite things that a lot of my students gave me feedback on was a debate podcast that we did, where they took argumentation skills, and rather than just writing an essay, they planned it out. They got all of their information, and they actually debated on an audio podcast platform, and they really enjoyed it. And so what I kind of realized through all this is that through my first years of teaching, what I was really missing was this kind of identity. I was trying to just copy and paste stuff that I had gotten from others, and I was not making it uniquely my own. And kind of around that same time I was making this realization, I inadvertently kind of stumbled into something that would kind of symbolize that identity to me. It was just a simple thing. I bought a pair of Star Wars socks. Yep, I had a pair of R2-D2 and a pair of Darth Vader socks. And what it was I decided that I wanted to do something to make me feel more like myself when I was in my classroom. I'm a nerdy guy. I love fantasy and science fiction. I grew up on movies like Star Wars, and I can't tell you how many times I've watched Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and all that. And so what I did is I wore those socks. And it was just kind of a thing. I had, my khakis and my button-up shirt, and I looked like a normal everyday teacher, but I knew in my head that underneath those khaki pants was Darth Vader or R2-D2. And that collection grew. I started to kind of build up more. I had Star Wars, I had Marvel, I had DC, Mario, Legend of Zelda, Harry Potter, all kinds of things. That's just real like nerd culture stuff. And it was just a subtle way of me bringing myself into my classroom. And it even kind of became a thing with my students. I even had one class that year that would refuse to let me begin class until I showed them what socks I was wearing today. And again, it was a small thing, but that little 15-second exchange made a lot of a difference in the way I was teaching my class. And so eventually, that kind of brings me up to the point where I am now, where I wanted to share my experiences. I wanted to share insights and things with other teachers. And so I kind of developed this theory of education that I follow, and I use the acronym COMIC, C-O-M-I-C. And it's just my way of looking at the things that I'm doing in my class to make sure that I am teaching my students to the best of my abilities and utilizing them and their strengths in class as well. And so all of the episodes that I'll do, videos that I create on YouTube, blog entries that I do, all fit into one or more of these categories. The C it stands for cultivating relationships. I think knowing students and getting connected to them and developing relationships with them is one of the most important things that we can do. The O is for optimizing class time and just making the best use of the time that we have in class while they are in class. M is for maximizing potential, maximizing who you are as an educator, maximizing who your students are as people. I is for integrating technology and making the best use of technological resources that we have, not just to have technology in our classrooms, but to actually utilize them to enhance what we're doing. And then the last C is challenging students. Students need to be challenged. They might do so reluctantly, but giving them something challenging often engages them a whole lot more. And so I've taken that and molded that into what I do in my classroom. And that's what led me to developing this podcast, so that I could create a community and join others in their journeys in creating that. So that's my story. I know a lot of you have similar ones, and that will bring me to this week's 8-Bit Crew Members Bulletin Board. So I hope that there are at least a few things from my story that you're able to connect to, or things that may help you out along your journey. So this week's question of the week, I want to know, what's your story? What has your educational journey looked like up to this point? If you want to share that on Twitter, you can use the hashtag 8BitCrew, the number 8BitCrew. Or if you have longer posts, you can go to the episode page at 8bitinstructor.com and post your stories there. I look forward to hearing the journey that some of you have gone on. Well, that will just about wrap up this debut episode of the 8-Bit Instructor podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate the help and the support. Make sure that you get connected with me. I'm on Twitter at Comic Socks, or you can use the hashtag 8BitCrew. If you enjoyed this show, please make sure that you hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts from, as well as leaving a review on your podcast app. But more importantly, please tell others. Word of mouth is how things spread a whole lot quicker than something like a review or a 5-star rating. So if you know other teachers that could benefit from this, please let them know so that we can build up our community. if you would like to support the show, you can visit my Patreon page at www.patreon.com/8bitinstructor. And I will be working on getting up some benefits and maybe some products for my patrons. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. Other than that, I believe that will do it for this first episode. And until next week, may your swords stay sharp and your shields hold strong. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and check out the 8-Bit Instructor YouTube channel for EdTech tips and tutorials, as well as other content on my website, 8bitinstructor.com. And of course, don't forget to follow me on Twitter @ComicSocks and use the hashtag 8BitCrew. See you next week.